Instead of putting a regular background in or painting what you see in the reference photo, we are going to switch to putting a sky behind those two pairs. This is a good practice for you, but it's also going to allow you to do a true gradient. We were talking a little bit about that last class. Here you can see me mixing up some values ahead of time. I took the dark blue that we have, the cerulean blue, which is that kind of sky blue color. I put in a dot of red for the top, and then I put in a drop of yellow. That sky that we're looking at here to the right technically has some green in it, so I added yellow to the blues. You can see what I'm doing. I squint with one eye, close one eye, and hold up my palette knife to my reference picture to see how closely I am matching those two values. Tend to see a little bit more of a purple hue. It's barely there, but there is a drop of magenta. As you progress down towards the horizon line, you tend to see a little bit of yellow. In fact, you can see it quite clearly in that reference photo. Once you have a minimum of 3 values pre-mixed on your palette, then it's okay to go ahead and start to paint. I am painting with the darkest value of blue that I made, and I did match it to the reference photo, and I did put in a dot of magenta in there. So it is important to lay out almost a full palette when you're painting. Even if you think you don't think you're going to use all those colors, I would at least use 2 of the yellows, 2 of the reds, 2 of the blues, and then white. Here, you shouldn't use any black. There should be no black in that sky. We're trying to pitch it more to a vibrant, intense kind of hue. So when you're doing this, you're still doing it in short strokes. I tend to do little X marks for my strokes. So I'll do one direction, swoop up, one direction, swoop down. Now you remember, to do a gradient, what you can do a couple of things. You can overlap your stroke to create a gradient. You can match value for value as you scale down, as you go progressively lighter, or you can do like a bridge color, so get a color that's in between those two values. You can also work wet into wet. So I'm doing kind of all those methods. I do want to take a moment to show you what my brush is doing. And I've slowed this down so you can see, like, I do a couple of strokes, I pull up, I pull down, but it's kind of erratic. It's not like it's a perfect vertical or horizontal every stroke. I'm actually kind of angling my stroke here. And I twist my brush, so I use my index finger and my thumb, and I kind of roll that brush to twist it to get into tight spaces like you're seeing here around the pear stem. I've turned my brush so that way I can get into that tight space. It is a good practice to do a stroke and then flip to the other side of your brush, because you have more paint on your other side of your brush as long as you've been dipping in both sides. So when you go to dip your brush in the paint, you dip it first on one side and then you flip to the other side of the brush. That way you don't have to keep going back to your palette to pick up paint. You already should have some on your brush. Many painters, when they're painting the sky, will tend to go kind of erratic like you're seeing me do here. I think that's a good practice. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it can help with blending, but two, it adds variety to your brushwork. So it's not like all horizontal strokes, which is really flattening and kind of boring. This adds some life to the sky, so you have a little bit of rhythm and there's a tiny bit of like pattern going on, just because of the brushwork. Now when you're doing this, I still want you to think back to tick marks, because there should be other flickers of other colors within that same value range there. You can see I just shifted down to a lighter hue, so I'm adding some white, but I also added some yellow there. So it's these subtle changes that need to happen to the paint in order for it to kind of ombre or gradiate down to a lighter shade. Here's an example of how you can twist your brush kind of sideways using just your index and thumb finger to do that, to get into a tight space. You can really start to see the gradient happening here. It's not perfect, but remember, we are going to be doing a second coat. This is just layer 1, so kind of more purpley at the top, more of a mid-tone blue in the middle area, and then as it goes down to the horizon, it becomes paler, but it also becomes a little bit more flavored with yellow. And you do want to make sure that you're covering the white of the page when you're doing this. Again, these are short strokes. using either a medium or a wide brush, so probably your biggest brush. I tend to use my bigger brushes for skies, and I would either go in a vertical stroke or, as you're seeing here, that kind of erratic X stroke or diagonals, and try pulling both up and down. So we are going to be working too on the lands because we're making this into kind of like a faux landscape where the pears are positioned in that landscape. And we're doing this so that you get practice on how to gradiate a sky, but this is also a good intro to landscape. What I'm doing now is there's some hills in the background there and there's some green grass. Those hills have to start to take on the color of the sky as they go farther back. So things that recede in space, especially if they recede in terms of miles, they tend to take on the color of the sky. That's called atmospheric, so it does have a name. We're going to talk more about that too. Those hills, they should look kind of blue. They're not the same blue as what you see in the sky. I've taken those colors, but I've added more yellow and more red to them, or magenta. So you've probably seen this phenomenon before if you're in the car and you're driving and you can see some distant hills, like if you've ever seen Mount Shasta. It looks blue for a ways until you get up close, and then it doesn't look blue anymore. It has browns and earth tones in it, but from a distance it will look blue. That's what we're doing here with these hills. We're trying to make them look like they're far back. And remember what we talked about with having edges that are kind of soft or out of focus? That's one place where you'd want them to be out of focus. All right, so you're seeing a little bit of a jump because I was working on that foreground and I was looking at a reference picture and I'm looking at grass, but I'm also still keeping an eye on the reference picture of the pears because I'm going to need to know exactly where those shadows, those cast shadows need to be placed, because I'm going to have to put those into this painting too. Otherwise it will look odd if the cast shadows are in the wrong position. So I'm trying to replicate grass, so I'm doing short strokes here, kind of pulling at a diagonal, a little bit of a curve, and here comes those cast shadows. Remember, the rule is about cast shadows is the cast shadows have to take on some of the color that's in the ground plane. So the ground plane is green, so the shadows, the cast shadows, are a darker version of those cast shadows. When possible, I try and avoid putting white in cast shadows, so my cast shadows here have no white in them. Now that's not true of the grass and it's not true of those distant hills, but that is true of cast shadows. If possible, avoid white. And how do you avoid white? You can, instead of using white to lighten, you can use another color to lighten, like yellow or red. And same kind of idea that as the grass stems go back, they get paler and a little bit desaturated. We talked a bit about desaturation. You can desaturate through adding white. You can also desaturate by adding the opposite to the color on the color wheel. So the opposite of green would be red. Most leaves and grass have like a earth tone hue to them, so they're not just pure green, otherwise it would look like an emerald green. You need to add a dot of red or magenta to that green to make it look more believable, more like earth tone. At this stage I only have one layer throughout the whole painting. It definitely needs a second coat. You can see just on the screen that there are areas where it's transparent and I need those to go opaque. So we will be doing a layer 2 on this painting. This is just the first layer.